Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the first week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Since 1990, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I, spies who've come in from the cold, the title of the John le Carré novel from our youth, will try to say some true things, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. This is a fire and ice edition of News from Neptune. I don't really like Robert Frost as a poet, but a century ago he published some verse appropriate for today. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Well, we may be finding out whether the ice suffices this week here in town, but we're also trying to decide the same thing in regard to politics in the world at large. What's on your list, David, for this week?
Well, we've got some leftover things from not having done a show last week, and we've got some new things, and I'm open to, whatever you have to offer here. I was going to start on a lighter note from a couple weeks ago. The New York Times, which will find any reason to criticize Donald Trump, even silly reasons, was critical of him for not attending the Kennedy Center honors. Did you catch that?
I saw that much. I didn't hear much more about it.
As I'm sure you know, Carl, the Kennedy Center honors every year 5 of our leading artists, and it's become a sort of a yearly ritual attended by the Washingtonian elite, who invented this ceremony in order so that they could rub shoulders, in my opinion, so that they could sort of rub shoulders with the crass people like Henry Kissinger and so forth, could rub shoulders with people like Arthur Miller and the various people that they've honored. That's just one random name out of the past. And predictably, Donald Trump didn't attend this because, say what you will about Donald Trump, he doesn't have any pretenses about being a culturally with it person. And of course, this brought down the New York Times upon his head, confirming the idea that Washington just isn't what it used to be. But I haven't watched these Kennedy Center honors for years, even though I used to enjoy seeing, learning a little about the background of the people that they were honoring, who are certainly, deserving of these honors. Although this year, apparently they honored LL Cool J, and I don't know anything about LL Cool J, so I have to catch up on that. So, but still, I stopped watching it many years ago because I couldn't stand that they would pan into the audience with the Washington elite, and you would see Condi Rice, and you would see Madeleine Albright, and you would see people like that. I'm saying, this does not work for me anymore in the David Green post-Chomsky era. I mean, pre-Chomsky it worked, but post-Chomsky it doesn't work. And if Noam Chomsky were president, he wouldn't attend the Kennedy Center honors either.
And he didn't get a Kennedy Center honor either, did he?
He hasn't got it. You can't call his work art, I guess. So I don't know if you had any response to that.
What it reminds me of,
before I move on.
What it reminds me of is the line that you hear. In fact, in Washington, I grew up in Washington, and I remember when the Kennedy Center was built, as a matter of fact, and they began the system, which is exactly as you describe, of Kennedy Center honor celebrity that would allow politicians to play too. It's the old line in Washington: politics is show business for ugly people, and the ugly people get the chance in the Kennedy Center honors. If the Trump presidency has the effect of puncturing some of this pretension, That may be no bad thing.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, there's not much else I can say for Trump, but
Well,
the
I think we should stop talking about Trump anyhow. The
Of
problem
course,
is not.
of course.
No, I
So
mean
let's
only
move
that
on.
you and I have been discussing with various friends and associates around town that the controversial observation that Trump is not the problem. It's U.S. war making that's the problem, and that's indeed what we should be talking about. And that's very much on my mind.
Well, there's certainly plenty of war making to be talking about. I'll leave that to you, perhaps after I finish a few comments
Okay.
that are not directly related to that. Just a few things to get off my chest. The usual News Gazette comment. There's a misunderstanding, a sort of propagandistic misunderstanding in so many News Gazette articles, what they choose to cover in relation to how the economy is doing, in terms of the stock market, how the economy is doing in terms of how many homes are being sold and how much they're being sold for. And it's worth noting that this data doesn't have anything to do with how the economy, as people experience it, is actually doing. And the most obvious example, of course, is that when you're talking about how home sales are doing, well, home sales and the prices of homes and home values was doing just fine between about 2003 and 2008. And then it all came crashing down because it was being done under false pretenses. And so, but the News Gazette carries on with articles about how the local economy is doing in that regard, and then talking about the stock market in the Trump era. And again, the stock market, the prices really have nothing to do with most people who don't have stocks and don't have savings. And if anything, it indicates that people are putting their money in the stock market, but corporations aren't necessarily investing in new equipment or new production or hiring people, and that's pretty well understood. And nobody can say when it is that the bubble is going to burst or how much of a bubble it is that we really have right now. But all the indicators are still that the rich are getting richer. There's some minor indications that people are making a little bit more money, or that their wages are raising, but barely, if at all, beyond the rate of inflation, and therefore there isn't really much that can be said for 50% or 2/3 or even 90% of the people who are pretty much not back to where they were, or just barely back to where they were after the crash in 2008. I wanted to sort of revisit the issue of opioids, which I spoke about a few weeks ago, just because I know you might have seen I posted a response from a fellow who's been writing on Counterpunch, not recently, but a few weeks ago about that, and just reiterate the idea that with all the PR that had to do with the Sackler family, who owns Purdue Pharma, who produces opioids, that and also in terms of a decent understanding of how opioids especially affect communities that are negatively affected by neoliberal policies. Ultimately, a pretty fundamental issue is the importance of the decriminalization of drugs. And when you think about it, it only makes sense. It's just that we get this idea in our head that opioids, or heroin and various other related substances, are different from other drugs that people use legally on a daily basis. People need their cigarettes, they need their other pharmaceutical drugs, they need their alcohol. People need all kinds of things that they can get if they're willing to pay for it, that the government regulates in various ways. And opioids shouldn't be any different. That isn't going to solve the economic problems of those areas that are most affected by opioid use, but at least it will bring it out into the open, so people don't overdose on these drugs that come into the system when the supply of opioids is artificially restricted, and then they end up using more powerful drugs, but more less laboratory tested drugs like fentanyl and so forth. So I've become just even more confirmed on that issue, and partly because it's just one of those issues that is complicated. More so, I mean, it can be subjected to the sort of neoliberal critique that we often use on this program, but it's a little more complicated than that. And the other sort of issue that I've been delving into a little bit in terms of violence and homicides and murders in a historical perspective, that there have been some articles recently about. It's worth noting that as much as we talk about the economic aspect of that, the neoliberal aspect of that, structural racism and so forth, there's another sort of complicating aspect that's get thrown into the mix that research has shown to be implicated in the steep rise in violence in the 80s and 90s, and the rather dramatic fall in homicides and other criminal violence since then. And that is lead, the issue of lead in our water and lead in our gas, and more research, which is done, is difficult research done with massive data sets that, can be poked at in all kinds of ways. But something we have to throw into the mix here in our understanding of these things is the fact that apparently lead can have a bad effect, especially on boys who become men, who are affected in ways that may have been a contributing factor to the increasing homicide rate in the 1990s, which of course was not well understood at the time, which continued the war on drugs, the mass incarceration, and the broken windows policies that were supposed to address these things. And these are, on the one hand, extremely complicated issues. And so I don't, as we're trying to say truthful things on these programs, I don't want to deny that there are a lot of things that are poorly understood that need enormous amounts of research, as opposed to just understanding everything in a sort of economic material context, as important and fundamental as those things are. So I'll leave it there, and perhaps you have a comment on either of those issues.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
You are watching News from Neptune, our first program of the new year, and we're trying to talk about some of the things that are bothering the commonality around the world that we might even be able to do something about. David and I have both been reading the writings of the political writer Vijay Prashad, who was here in town some time ago, and writes about the political questions that center these days on Iran. He gave a talk on Iran for the Real News Network that David often points us to as something to be paid attention to. I think he's right. And I'd like to get to that, but also like to get to a couple of other things that Prashad has written that turn up on the website Counterpunch, run by our friend Jeffrey Sinclair. Prashad said, and I quote here, Trump's national security strategy, a 55-page document, some news outfits said it was longer, that was published last month, which Prashad calls, I quote, a defensive response to old rivals China and Russia, reasserting their position in the world. Now, I think that's not wrong, but it's a very odd way to put it, it seems to me. The national security strategy, which is a position paper that the Pentagon, et cetera, presents really every 10 years. So it's a big deal about the American war making in the world. The national security strategy is not peculiar by any means to the Trump administration, and the one that was issued in December and presented, I must say, by Trump in a very peculiar speech, is a summary of what the American government, and not any one particular administration, regards the world as being and suggests what American strategy, particularly military strategy, is regarding that situation. There weren't any surprises, I think, particularly in the document, but I'm surprised that Prashad finds it surprising in the description he offers. He calls it a defensive response to old rivals China and Russia, reasserting their position in the world. Well, as I say, that's not wrong, but it's an odd way to put it. That the U.S. position is defensive in regard to China and Russia may be understandable if you make sense of the fact, or if you begin with the fact that the U.S. has been provoking China and Russia around the world for more than a generation. That the settled bedrock of American foreign policy, going back really to the 19th century, is to prevent the economic integration and development of Eurasia, that is China and Russia and environs, to prevent that, precisely because if that occurs, the ability of the American economic elite to exploit the rest of the world will be, it is assumed, in some ways trammeled up. That's the basis for the U.S. hostility to the Chinese New Silk Road program, as it's called, or better, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, the attempt of China to build a system of interconnected land and sea routes that will economically integrate Eurasia. This, as I say, has been the bête noire of American foreign policy since the open door policy of 1899, when the U.S. said, look, nobody, and in those days they were talking about Western imperialist powers, nobody is going to establish a closed set of doors to East Asia because we intend to break through those doors and exploit East Asia ourselves. That's what the American government said in 1899 with its image of the open door. Well, now what's happening is that the U.S. is facing the attempt of revolutionary China, resurgent China, to close some doors itself from the American point of view. In fact, they're not closed doors at all. The U.S. objects to China's attempting to open doors economically around the world to their Belt and Road Initiative. The metaphor may be getting a bit out of hand here, but the point is that the suggestion there's something new about what the U.S. is doing in trying to interfere with Chinese and Russian economic development is amazing. It's outrageously wrong. And for Vijay Prashad to write, who's no idiot, he knows very well what he's talking about, to write it in a way that can be interpreted like that seems to me to be very strange indeed. Prashad says, and I quote here, the most important aspect here is, I think, what they call principled realism. Principled realism, I mean, one of those silly phrases that American political discourse offers up occasionally for the aggressive stance to the rest of the world that it has taken since the 19th century. By this principled realism, Prashad writes, what they mean, what the U.S. government means, I think, is that the United States should no longer see Russia and China as partners in a global enterprise. Wait a minute. When did the U.S. ever see Russia and China as partners in a global enterprise? You might say on those few occasions when the U.S. thought it could control Russia and China, and particularly their economies. Now, there were a couple of occasions like that. In regard to China, and most notably after the Second World War, when the U.S. thought that its clients in China would organize post-war China, and were shocked to the core when it turned out that the opponents of their clients, that is to say the Chinese Communist Party, established their revolution in 1949. That in some ways is the greatest reversal for American foreign policy in the 20th century. As far as Russia is concerned, the U.S. thought that when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, that the U.S. would control the Russian economy and reduce it to the status of a third world provider of raw materials. And that was directly the the policy of the Clinton administration, thought they could use the easy tool Boris Yeltsin, unknown dipsomaniac, for that purpose, and sent American Harvard-trained economists to Russia to reorganize the Russian economy in favor of the oligarchs who would take orders from Washington. What happened in Russia was that the rise of the Putin government frustrated these American plans. So at the end of the 20th century, we had in both China and Russia a situation that controverted, that confounded American expectations for its control of Russia and China. That's why the U.S. is so concerned about the Putin administration and about the economic policies of China's President Xi Jinping. So for someone as knowledgeable as Prashad to say that U.S. military policy is a defense, I quote, a defensive response to old rivals China and Russia reasserting their position in the world is not wrong, but it's a very strange way to use the word defensive. Defensive means the U.S. domination might not be able to continue as clearly as it thought it would. And this is the confusion on which the account of the American policy begins. The attempt to recognize what's really going on in the world and the real relationship between the U.S., China, and Russia may be the most important task for people who want to make sense of what's going on right now. It's not about Trump. It's about the U.S. relationship to the rest of the world, which is expressed in military terms.
There doesn't seem to be any chance that Trump isn't down, whatever this Trump doctrine is, and all too much was made of it
Quite right.
in the mainstream media. And by Vijay Prashad himself, and you're right, in some strange ways. He also commented rather strangely on Trump's willingness to abandon the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is something that, the good people are supposed to be in favor of, not participating in that. Right. And Trump's reasons for abandoning that may have not been to their liking, but I found it kind of strange that Prashad was kind of using that as in a sense as a way of arguing for neoliberal policies as opposed to opposed to neoliberal policies. But it's just that Trump, on the one hand, Trump gets people crazy, and they think they have to oppose whatever he's for.
Exactly.
And on the other hand, they take all too seriously with this pronouncement, this Trump doctrine, and this what was it called? Realism, something.
Yeah.
Whatever.
The word principled realism. Come on.
You take the word from column A and a word from column B, and you mix and match them in various ways, and you come up with the same old thing, which is again. Our director Ethan is busy reading a book there by Noam Chomsky, Who Rules the World, right? Uh-huh. So that's the question, who rules the world?
Best book ever.
But yeah, and and so Carl foisted that book on poor Ethan, but still. But anyway, the question always comes back to what is the U.S. up to? Not so much in its strategy, which stays the same, but in its tactics, which vary according to. And again, we're dealing with different tactics here as we move from the Obama era to the Trump era in relation to the Middle East, for example, in relation to Iran or Israel-Palestine, we see different tactics in terms of what's been going down in the last couple of weeks. In terms of what's going on in Iran and the sort of mini rebellion or protests that are going on in there, in terms of Israel and Palestine, in terms of the little mini intifada that's going on there in response to Trump's pronouncements about recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. I don't see any of this as really changing what the U.S. strategy, what their goals are in that region or any other region.
I think that's quite right. I came across a phrase I liked this week, Trump washing. Trump washing. Uh-huh. Trump washing has nothing to do with, changing the color of his hair or something. Trump washing means whitewashing, obscuring, or rewriting the broader U.S. record by presenting Donald Trump as an aberration. You Trump wash a policy by saying, well, okay, this is what the Trump administration is doing, when it turns out to be what the U.S. has been doing all along, under different coloring, perhaps, no pun intended, in the Obama administration and elsewhere. So Trump washing the policies towards Iran, for example, is very important indeed. The media try to pretend there's a great difference between the policies of the Obama administration and the Trump administration in regard to Iran. It's much more, what David was just talking about, a difference in tactics, not strategy. The strategy remains very much the same, indeed the same that it's been for a century: prevent the economic integration of Eurasia as a challenge to the worldwide economic control of the American 1%. That's the strategy. That's what they're going to do. That's what they're going to try to do. They may find better or worse ways to do it from their point of view, and that's a difference in tactics. That explains, for example, the difference over the Iranian nuclear deal, as it's called, the JCPOA, that's now, well, almost 3 years old. That was a tactical change, perhaps, and the Trump administration has attacked that tactical, but the strategy remains much the same. There was an account on the Real News Network by a couple of commentators, including Trita Parsi, who spoke here recently, and a man called Eskander Sadegh of the University of Oxford, that I thought did a better job of giving an account of what's going on in Iran than anything else that I've seen. The coverage, of course, can't be trusted at all in this country, but the more I look at it, the more it seems to me that the interesting question is the overall position of the United States and the ongoing strategy of the United States vis-a-vis Iran. The U.S. has been torturing Iran for 60 years since we overthrew its government in the 1950s, and the goals of U.S. strategy remain very much the same. The account of the current situation is particularly murky, I think, in the American media, because this point is not realized, that the American policy remains essentially the same, even though tactics change. You think there's something to that, David?
Yeah, I mean, this may be getting a little too much into inside baseball, but I've been noticing the usual lining up in regards to what's going on in Iran right now, in terms of either outside interference, provoking what was happening, or what exactly the real grievances of the Iranian people are,
yes,
and what the role of the Americans in it. And I entered a comment on our friend Louis Proyect, of course, has immediately lined up in the idea that there's a bunch of leftists out there, a bunch of the people that he identifies being on the anti-imperialist left, who will jump to the conclusion that the rebellion in Iran or the protests in Iran are a CIA operation of some kind, and that he immediately starts to mock any indication that anybody thinks anything that's the CIA, which of course overthrew the government in Iran in 1953, installed the Shah for the next 26 years after that, that there's any indication that the CIA could be involved with that, or that U.S. foreign policy could be involved in that. But as usual, I think Lewis misses. First of all, he's attempting to paint with extremely broad brush about people who he feels think that the U.S. is the problem of every sort of characterizing this leftist point, this so-called leftist point of view, as being involved in blaming the United States for everything that's going on in the world, even when there are legitimate grievances being had. But to get to the point here, I don't think that's what's happening. I don't think that's what people are saying. That isn't what Trita Parsi was saying on this interview with Aaron Mate. That's not what the other fellow was saying. There's a couple of other interviews that Trita Parsi participated in. There was also there's a kind of apparently an MSNBC interaction that he had with Bill Kristol, which went kind of viral because basically Bill Kristol is the one saying, Bill Kristol proving the point, saying, hey, go Iranians, and Trita Parsi sort of saying, Bill, you've been advocating bombing Iran for quite a while. That isn't supporting the American. That isn't supporting the Iranian people. That's wanting to kill them.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of cross currents here.
And he immediately says, "Oh, I never wanted to kill the Iranian people. I just wanted to kill the government."
Right,
which of course is nonsense. Right.
But I think just from reading, from scanning the articles that were on Counterpunch this morning and a couple of other places, the Real News Network, I think it's being well understood that Iran has a seriously corrupt government that has made it extremely difficult for its people to get by, and they're reacting to that at some level, which is different from the way they reacted a few years ago when there was a revolt. And B, that U.S. sanctions have something to do with that. They may not have everything to do with that, but they have something to do with that. Right. So you kind of have to stop putting labels on people and talk about both things. Nothing that's going on in terms of Iran's rebellion mitigates at all the fact that the U.S. and Israel and Saudi Arabia have made Iran their mortal enemy because it threatens their interest in controlling the resources of the region.
That's the crucial point. I must say that as I read the pieces that you referred to, David, I'm almost ready to believe that the protests in Iran can be paralleled to the populist uprising that produced Trump in this country over against the Rouhani government, the existing government in Iran, playing the role of the Obama government. All analogies limp, and this one is particularly club-footed, I think. But the fact of the matter is that to see what's going on in Iran now as a populist response to a reform government, reform within the circumstances of the regime as a whole, is not wrong in seeing a parallel to the Trump campaign, the Trump election, over against a reform government in the Obama administration, where we understand reform as the neoliberal policies that the Obama government has followed and that the Obama administration has followed, and that were attacked by Trump in the campaign. Now, it takes some effort to draw these parallels, but it's a lot better than to say, yes, here are good guys in Iran revolting against bad guys, and we should send weapons to the good guys, which is the position that the American neoconservatives are taking right now. That's outrageous, dangerous, criminal, and should be opposed. But in order to oppose it, we have to have some better understanding of what actually is going on in Iran. And that's why I'm happy to see things like the Real News Network being one of the few attempts to give a good account of what's happening there.
Yeah, and it confuses the issue even more, and particularly Louis Project and some others confuse it even more by thinking that they're scoring points or thinking that they're being very clever by pointing out that governments like Iran and Syria have implemented neoliberal policies themselves in recent decades. It isn't any secret that they have done so. The leaders of these countries would like to play ball with the neoliberal global order. They represent elites that would like to play ball with the neoliberal order and benefit the same way the top 10% or 1% or 0.1% in all these other countries, Europe, in this country and so forth, benefit from this neoliberal order. But they aren't doing it in quite the way that finds enough favor because of the peculiarities of the Middle East region and how that's operating there, they can't play the neoliberal game well enough to fit in with America's global plans. And of course, Russia and China mess up the whole thing. And they just want to be normal neoliberal countries in their own way. Nobody's saying that these countries want to have a different game. They just want a bigger piece of the pie. But America wants to govern, again, who rules the world. America wants to dictate how the game is being played.
That's exactly right, and that's the reason we're killing people in countries around the world. That the U.S. military has 250,000 soldiers or more in more than 150 countries in the world. The rest of the world recognizes that. The rest of the world understands that the U.S. is trying to control the world economy by military means, and it resists it in various ways. The timorous resistance of the European states and the armed resistance of states in the Middle East and elsewhere, and the serious resistance of Russia and China makes for contemporary, dangerous international politics. And the real problem, of course, comes from the government that we're responsible for. This is from the Real News 2 days ago. Mm-hmm. They say, and I quote, pro-government rallies in favor of the government of Iran. Pro-government rallies are being held in Iran today, 2 days ago, after nearly a week of nationwide protests against the country's leaders. Tens of thousands have turned out for demonstrations supporting the Iranian government in at least 10 cities. You haven't heard much of that on CNN. What we have heard is the fact that there were serious anti-government protests in Iran. The larger, apparently, pro-government protests that followed have not been much reported here. This follows days of clashes that have left at least 22 people dead. The initial protests began with conservatives, but quickly spread to other citizens disgruntled with a struggling economy and rising inequality. Does that sound familiar, by the way? Disgruntled citizens, citizens disgruntled with a struggling economy and rising inequality. They elected Donald Trump here. There are reports those protests are now dying down, just as government supporters are turning out. The government has arrested more than 530 people and restricted access to social media in a bid to crack down on the protests. The original protests began with conservatives, that is, people opposed to the reform measures of the central government in Iran, in the city of Mashhad. They were hoping to be able to put pressure and embarrass the more moderate President Rouhani, but it kind of got out of control because this message of economic grievance, that's where it began, economic grievance, and there are very real economic grievances, is something that a very large segment of the population agreed with. There are very legitimate grievances when it comes to the economic situation, as well as to the social and political situation. They quickly lost control over it, the conservatives, objecting to the reform measures, which, as David says, were largely neoliberal reforms of the current government in Tehran. And instead of just targeting the Rouhani government, it turned into a protest that is targeting the entire regime, including the conservative establishment, that is to say, the religious establishment that ran the revolution against the American-imposed dictator and succeeded in 1980.
In these articles, the word hardliners is often used to denote, I guess, the clerics,
right,
the clerical element who doesn't think who thinks Rouhani is too liberal, or
exactly, Yes, that's right. And although the government, there's a problem there because of the peculiar nature of the Iranian government with a religious establishment behind it, and as I said a moment ago, essentially a neoliberal reform administration comparable in some ways to the Obama administration in this country, in office in Tehran right now. It's worth pointing out that this current unrest, if that's the right word, in Iran is much smaller than what we saw in 2009, where there were more than 1 million or 2 million people in the streets of Tehran objecting to the government's essentially right-wing policies, economically right-wing policies. Objecting to the Ahmadinejad presidency in Iran had produced an economy with runaway inflation and unemployment. In 2009, that prompted the transition to the Rouhani government, which set out to solve those economic problems, and the objections to it now arise in part from the feeling that they have not, amongst the Iranian populace, that the problems have not been solved, that the government that was put in after the 2009 unrest has been unsuccessful in solving the economic problems that it was sent to do. And the greatest reason for the difficulties in solving those problems have been the American sanctions, have been the American economic warfare against Iran, part of the larger American policy of retarding the economic integration of Eurasia, because Iran has thrown in its lot with Russia and China, who have supported the Iranian attempt to develop its economy and indeed to exercise influence in the region, such as support for the government of Syria, which is allied to the government of Iran. It's in these circumstances that these outbreaks occur, and a lot of people are reminded of the CIA's encouragement of popular uprisings, up to and including actually hiring people to riot in the streets in 1953 in order to overthrow the democratic government of Iran. There are reflections on the extent to which the CIA is involved in the difficulties in Iran right now, the Israeli government as well. And it's difficult to determine. It would certainly be wrong to say that they aren't involved, to say that there is no interest on the part of the CIA and the government of Israel in causing distress in Iran. On the other hand, it's certainly right to see that the difficulties of the Iranian economy, in the context indeed of American policy, are what prompt the outbreaks that we've seen in the last week or so. But once again, one gets a very peculiar idea of this through the American media, and one does not hear, for example, of the corresponding pro-government demonstrations that occur and the general relationship of the policy of the government of Iran to American foreign policy and the integration of that policy with those of Russia and China. This is what we should be talking about.
Just to refer back to the program the MSNBC panel that I referred to. So you had Bill Kristol, neocon Bill Kristol. You had Trita Parsi, who's sort of being presented as a Iranian, as someone who understands Iran, who's from Iranian background, who's a good enough guy not to be seen as, who's to be seen on the quote-unquote liberal MSNBC as being an authoritative voice. You have some diplomat, I forget his name, Lafler or some guy. I don't think he was he wasn't a diplomat with Iranian experience. I'm not sure, but he was entering in there. I never watched MSNBC, so I'm not familiar with some of these. And they had this woman moderating it in this kind of harsh way, which made it very clear, ultimately made it very clear that there's bad stuff going on here. But in the background is the nuclear deal, and what Trita Parsi is arguing in this venue and a couple of other venues is that this is going to give Trump an excuse to do what he wanted to do anyway, which is to abandon the nuclear deal insofar as it can be abandoned. And so what, in the context of the liberal MSNBC, Russiagate MSNBC, or MSDNC as it's often called, in this context, it's very clear that Bill Kristol is representing the more dominant view that that in spite of the fact the Treaty of Parsi was on, that Bill Kristol is representing the view that people are comfortable with, because they're reasserting, he wants America to reassert quote unquote leadership in this context, and the people, the MSNBCers, the people who supported Hillary Clinton, are, as much as they oppose Trump, and as much as they may have supported Obama's nuclear deal, it isn't really about the nuclear deal
Exactly.
so much as it is about quote unquote American leadership, which means American control over what's
the
going
economy,
on.
particularly.
And that's
yes.
that's what the Trump, whatever is unpredictable about Trump, whatever is unknown or erratic about Trump, threatens their idea. They're much more comfortable with someone like Bill Kristol interpreting Iran in this way of, we've got to support these people revolting against this government. And in the same way, just to throw in something, Venezuela, it's like the way the New York Times has covered Venezuela in the last couple of weeks. And, just this propagandistic, horrible things are happening there. People are suffering for sure, but that's not why the New York Times is covering it the way that they are. They want a different government there.
And the parallel with Venezuela is important. First of all,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But for two reasons, the United States and oil.
Yeah.
The first reason is that both Venezuela and Iran are victims of American economic and even military oppression that is meant to reduce these governments that don't follow orders from Washington. When their governments did follow orders from Washington, everything was fine from the point of view of Washington. What is actually going on in both countries is bound up with the vagaries of oil and oil pricing over more than a decade. And that's the situation that we're looking at today as oil prices change notably, and the outcome of the economic warfare that the U.S. has been conducting against both Venezuela and Iran is unclear. Parsi is asked, and I quote here, "Do you think we'd be seeing these protests in Iran and this level of economic stagnation in Iran had Trump and the U.S. government lived up to the Iran nuclear deal, not taking steps that have deterred investment inside Iran?" Now, this is complicated. The nuclear deal, literally JC, or referred to in shorthand as JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal.
I never even knew what that stood for.
Well, it has very little to do with nuclear weapons either. I mean, that's the way it was presented in this country. What it has to do with is the economic control of Iran as a major oil producer. That's at the heart of American Middle Eastern policy and has been for years. That's what the Obama administration was working on, and it was a classic example of Obama fake left, drive right foreign policy, when they say, okay, we'll do a deal with Iran, it'll be good for Iran, it'll unfreeze some of their assets and so forth, but the result was to produce the same sort of economic control, indeed a more efficient economic control of Iran that America has been working towards ever since the fall of the Shah, where America had direct control there. The Trump economic policy, which is essentially the Obama economic policy under different rhetoric, Parsi says, I think is a very big component of it, because at the end of the day, people in Iran had the expectation that things were going to really move in a much more positive direction as a result of the nuclear deal. That was the carrot that was held out by the Obama people. Will help your economy. On paper, there's a lot of things with the Iranian economy that seem to be moving in the right direction. I mean, the growth is going to be roughly 4% this year, according to the IMF, better, of course, than the U.S., but that is almost exclusively driven by the fact that the Iranians can sell oil again. That was part of the nuclear deal. It was an oil deal, to attempt to remove some of the American sanctions on Iranian oil sales. But oil sales don't create jobs. What you need to do in order to actually create more social justice in Iran is to actually have a far greater amount of job creation because of the large number of young people that are entering the labor market on a yearly basis. Does this sound familiar, by the way? I mean, there's another country that's in that position as well. To create jobs, you need investment. You don't just need oil sales. To get investments, you need to make sure that the banks feel comfortable that nuclear deal is durable and that it's not constantly being attacked either from Iran or Trump or someone else. That sense of durability has not existed primarily because the Trump administration has made it very clear they're looking forward to killing the deal. Once again, that's right, but once again, that is a variation in tactics, not strategy. The long-term strategy remains the control of the Eurasian economy, including the Iranian connection with China and Russia. There are many other factors as well. There's also, of course, the Iranian government's own corruption, mismanagement, etc. But had these investments come in, there's a significant likelihood that the economic situation would have looked different, and it wouldn't have had a scenario in which the expectation gap had become as significant as it is right now, in which on the one hand people expected things to move forward and become much more positive because of the nuke deal, and on the other hand, now with this budget, there's austerity measures that is cutting their standard of living significantly. So the unrest you've been hearing about in Iran is directly bound up with the American dealing with the Iranian economy through the so-called nuke deal. Once again, you notice not much mention of nuclear weapons, really didn't have much to do with that. It did have a great deal to do with the American attempt to control the economy, not only of the Mideast, but indeed of Eurasia as a whole, but particularly in regard to the Mideast and oil. You're listening to News from Neptune. We're talking about the conflicted issue of the Iranian protests that you've been hearing about on MSNBC this week, and the accurate account of what's going on in the Middle East, given the American policy, which is never quite admitted to, the American policy of producing control over the world's greatest oil-producing region, and that control, of course, is as much involved with Eurasia as other American foreign policy. The main reason the U.S. wants to control oil flows from the Middle East is to have what the Pentagon calls offshore control over China. Offshore control means control over the fact that the U.S. That China imports most of its energy resources, and most of them from the Middle East. The U.S. controls the Middle East. The U.S. has a efficient control over its major economic rival in the world today, the economic rival that the new strategic strategy of the Trump administration talks about principally, that is China and its ally Russia. So in the old SDS phrase, everything is connected, but you won't hear that from American mainstream media.
One thing that I wanted to mention, that if you're a sort of smarty pants liberal, you point to countries like Venezuela and Iran, perhaps, or Saudi Arabia for that matter, if you're Thomas Friedman, and you say, wouldn't it be nice, it's the curse of oil. Wouldn't it be nice if these countries could diversify their economic productivity? Look at Venezuela. They had this chance. They have other resources besides oil, but they became too dependent on oil. Then they become dependent on their relationships with people buying oil and the price of oil, and currency, all the complexity of currency exchange that go along with that have made the Venezuelan economy so difficult for so many people, especially since Chavez died and since the price of oil went down. But one could take the sincerity of those analyses with a grain of salt. These people don't care about the people of Venezuela or Iran. They certainly don't care about them getting off oil. They want them to be contributing their oil to a global economy, which the United States is in control of, as you say. So again, it's it gets my hackles up. You see heart-wrenching photographs on the New York Times of starving children. There are many places in the world where there are starving children. That doesn't mitigate the suffering of the people of Venezuela or the decisions that their government might make. But you really have to sort of stand fast and see what's going on here, and who really wants a different world for those children and a different economy for those countries, which would be better for those children.
Trita Parsi, who we've been quoting today, concludes his discussion on the Real News Network, which we recommend in general, even if we occasionally have some differences with him. Yeah. He concludes his comments with, there's some very critical deadlines next week in which the United States is obligated to renew waivers on the sanctions as long as the Iranians are living up to their end of the nuclear deal, which, as we say, is not nuclear. The reports confirm that the Iranians are in compliance. There's a very high likelihood that Trump will use the current protest as a pretext to do what he'd planned to do anyways, which was not renew these waivers, and by that put the United States out of compliance, with the real potentiality triggering a process that could see the deal collapse as a result of that. In the midst of all this, there's something likely going to happen that will create a massive international crisis. It's worth paying attention to. I don't think that predictions in this area have been very accurate from any side for a while, but it is the case that the relationship of the U.S. government to Iran is volatile right now, made even more volatile by these protests, however much they were encouraged by the CIA or not, that respond to real differences within Iran. So the nexus of possibilities in regard to U.S. policy in the Middle East, and indeed U.S. policy in regard to Eurasia, is very great this week, and we should watch it because you're not going to get an honest account of it from the American mainstream media, who will simply tell you about the Trump administration's plans to send weapons to the brave protesters in Iran. Protesters may be brave, but there is a lot going on there that has to do with American policy, and as citizens of the American polity, it's up to us to try to understand what our government is actually doing and the interests it's serving, and what is happening in the world at large against the account that we've been receiving of it. In the words of Rosa Luxemburg more than a century ago, the most revolutionary thing one can do is to proclaim loudly what is actually happening. And it's the brilliance of the American media system that's almost impossible.
There's sort of several interrelated potential ironies involved in here, in which you may have Trump abandoning the Iran nuclear deal and being supported by the Clintonites in that regard.
Exactly.
And so you got to think about that.
Tune in next week and we'll tell you what happened. You've been watching News from Neptune for the first week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and best wishes for the new year.